Welcome to the Santiago Bernabéu, a place where legends are born and dreams come alive. But beneath the glory of this iconic stadium lies a darkness that few dare to explore. Tonight I will take you on a journey through the three scariest horror stories that haunt these hallowed grounds. Are you ready to face the fears that lurk in the shadows? 1. The Lost Fan of the Bernabéu. It was a game night, and the Santiago Bernabéu Stadium was electric with the roar of thousands of fans. I'd managed to get a last-minute ticket, and the atmosphere was like nothing I'd ever experienced. The crowd's energy was infectious, the lights blinding, and the stadium's noise deafening. But as I made my way through the labyrinth of corridors to find my seat, something felt off. The crowd felt too distant, like their voices echoed unnaturally in the vast space around me. I reached my section and took my seat, but as the game went on, I noticed a strange feeling creeping over me. I was surrounded by people, but somehow I felt completely alone. Every few minutes, my attention was drawn to the far end of the stadium. There, in the upper tier, was a figure, a lone man standing, staring at me. His face was obscured by the shadows, but his eyes gleamed red. I tried to shake the feeling, telling myself it was just my imagination playing tricks on me. But as the match wore on, I couldn't stop looking up at the figure. Every time I turned my head, there he was, closer. It felt like time was warping. The game's excitement began to fade, and the stadium lights flickered with a disturbing rhythm, like the pulse of something watching. Then, during the final moments of the match, the figure appeared before me, now in the aisle just a few rows away. I could hear a low voice whispering, "You should have left when you had the chance." I turned to run, but my feet felt like they were glued to the floor. The whispers grew louder, now coming from all around me. The crowd was gone. The stadium was empty. The last thing I remember was seeing the red eyes of the man as his hand reached out, and then, darkness. I woke up in the same seat, the stadium empty again, as if nothing had happened. But the feeling of those eyes following me never left. I didn't know what was happening. I kept telling myself it was just exhaustion, or perhaps the stress of being in such a large, overwhelming crowd. But as I turned my head again, there he was, the figure. His silhouette was barely visible against the shadows of the upper tier, but I could feel his gaze cutting through me like ice. The red gleam in his eyes was unmistakable. Every time I looked, he seemed closer. His presence felt like an oppressive weight on my chest. The game was still going on around me, but I felt as though I were in a different dimension. The cheers of the fans faded into the background, and the blinding stadium lights became distorted. The air was thick with unease, and the excitement of the game felt distant, like I was watching it through a fog. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong, that something was watching me. The figure's eyes were fixed on me, unmoving, waiting. I tried to focus on the match, to block out the feeling that had settled over me, but it was impossible. I kept sneaking glances toward that section, hoping it would be empty, hoping the figure was just some trick of the lighting, but it wasn't. It never was. As I looked up again, he was gone. But the strange sensation didn't leave me. I felt his presence in the pit of my stomach, like a knot of dread that tightened with every breath. The game ended, but I couldn't leave. My body felt frozen in place. I watched as the crowd slowly filed out of the stadium, but I couldn't move. Couldn't tear my eyes away from the dark corners of the stands. Suddenly, the lights flickered once again. The crowd had thinned, and only a few stragglers remained. Staff, security, and some last-minute fans. The eerie silence was almost suffocating. I stood up, my legs shaking, and began to walk towards the exit, desperate to escape. But as I turned a corner near the players' tunnel, I saw something that made my blood run cold. The figure was standing at the end of the corridor. I stopped dead in my tracks. This time, his face was clearer. His features were twisted in a grotesque grimace, the skin pale, and his eyes, those damn eyes, glowed a deep red. He wasn't just standing still anymore. He was moving towards me, slowly, as if savoring the moment. I could feel my heart pounding in my chest, my breath quickening. I turned to run, but my legs felt like they were made of lead. Suddenly I heard a voice in my ear. It was deep, guttural, almost as if it was coming from the very walls of the stadium. "You shouldn't have stayed after the game," it whispered. Now you belong to the Bernabéu. With every step I took, the figure seemed to get closer, his eyes never leaving mine. The echo of the whispers filled my mind, drowning out everything else. I could feel a chill, colder than anything I had ever experienced, creeping over me, as if the very air around me had turned to ice. I finally reached the exit, my hand trembling as I grabbed the door handle. The instant I pushed the door open, I heard a loud, bone-chilling laugh behind me, like a cackle of triumph. I stumbled into the night air, gasping for breath, my heart racing. The figure was gone, but the feeling that something had followed me lingered, like an invisible force, watching from the shadows. I ran to the nearest taxi, not daring to look back, and as I drove away, I couldn't shake the feeling that the Bernabéu would never let me go. That the figure I saw in the stands was just the beginning, and as the taxi sped through the city, I realized something horrifying. I was the last one to leave. Everyone else was gone. But there was one name that lingered in my mind, something I had read in an old article about the stadium, a name that haunted the halls of the Bernabéu, the lost fan. 2. The phantom whistleblower. I had been to the Santiago Bernabéu many times before, but this time was different. I had scored a spot as an assistant for a special event, organizing a pre-match VIP experience. The stadium was buzzing with excitement as fans poured in, and I had a front row seat to the chaos unfolding. It was late in the evening, and everything had settled down. The staff was preparing for the match, and the VIPs were already in their designated areas. That's when I noticed something unusual. In the distance, in one of the upper levels, I saw a lone figure standing by the edge of the section. At first, I assumed it was another staff member, maybe a cleaner or someone from security, but the figure never moved, and they didn't belong in that section. It was off limits. I wandered closer, curiosity pulling me towards the unknown figure, but as I neared, I noticed that no one seemed to notice him. The staff went about their work as if he wasn't there. As I took another step closer, I heard the unmistakable sound of a referee's whistle, but the game hadn't started yet. I froze in my tracks as the figure turned, and though I couldn't see his face clearly, I felt an undeniable sense of dread washing over me. He raised his hand and gave a sharp, loud whistle that sent chills down my spine. Suddenly, the lights flickered and the atmosphere in the stadium shifted. I heard the same whistle, now coming from the loudspeakers. The sound echoed, booming throughout the entire arena, as if something dark was calling for a penalty. The crowd, which had been buzzing just moments ago, fell eerily silent. I turned to leave, but the figure wasn't there anymore. He was now standing in the middle of the field. I rushed toward the exit, but the halls seemed longer and the lights dimmer. It felt like the walls were closing in. The whistle continued, louder and more distorted with each passing second, until it became deafening. I ran, not stopping until I was outside, gasping for breath. Later, I learned that the referee's whistle was a legend in the stadium. Supposedly, anyone who heard it was cursed to witness something unspeakable. The staff never acknowledged the figure, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I had been marked by whatever haunted those halls. The atmosphere inside the Bernabéu was suffocating. I had been at the stadium many times before, but something about this night felt different. The usual excitement of the match had been replaced by an eerie tension, like something was waiting to happen. I was with a group of friends, but even they noticed it. We were all slightly on edge, exchanging nervous glances every time the stadium lights flickered or a strange sound echoed through the empty halls. The game was nearing its end, and the score was tied. I could feel the anticipation building, the crowd murmuring with excitement as the final minutes ticked down. And then, it happened. I heard it. A piercing whistle. It wasn't coming from the field. It wasn't the referee's whistle that everyone had become accustomed to hearing. This whistle was sharp, almost deafening, and it seemed to come from somewhere far above us. My friends and I turned toward the sound, but the stands were completely empty above us, save for a few stray figures in the distance. The whistle blew again, louder this time, echoing through the empty upper tiers of the stadium. The crowd was still cheering, unaware of what was happening above. It was as if the noise from the whistle didn't even register with them. But to me, it was impossible to ignore. I looked around the stands, trying to locate the source, but there was nothing. No person, no movement, just the deep hum of the crowd and that sharp, haunting whistle cutting through the air. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up. I turned to my friends and said, "Did you hear that?" They stared at me, confusion written on their faces. "What are you talking about?" "The whistle," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. That whistle!" They shrugged it off, assuming it was just part of the game or perhaps some kind of malfunctioning sound system. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something else was going on. My gut told me that something dark was unfolding right in front of us, and I had to figure out what. I stood up and walked toward the tunnel where the sound had originated. My footsteps echoed through the deserted corridor as I made my way deeper into the stadium, my heart pounding in my chest. The further I went, the more the sound of the whistle seemed to grow, louder and clearer. And then I saw it. At the far end of the hall, illuminated only by a faint light, was the shadowy figure of a man standing alone. His back was turned toward me, and he was holding something that looked like a whistle. He didn't move, didn't speak, just stood there, his figure almost blending into the darkness around him. It was as if he had been waiting for me. I took a cautious step forward, my breath coming in shallow gasps. "Who are you?" I called out, but my voice felt small, swallowed up by the vast, empty stadium. The figure didn't respond. Instead, he raised the whistle to his lips again and blew. This time, the sound was deafening. My vision blurred, and the air seemed to press in around me. The sharp whistle echoed in my mind, reverberating like it was coming from inside my skull. My head began to spin, and I staggered back, clutching my temples. The lights above flickered, casting strange shadows on the walls. I had to get out. I had to leave. But as I turned to run, the figure moved. He was in front of me now, blocking my path. His face was still hidden in shadows, but I could feel his presence, a cold, oppressive force that made the air feel thick and suffocating. And then I heard his voice. "You shouldn't have come here," he said, his voice a low, raspy whisper. I froze, panic flooding my chest. "What do you mean? Who are you?" He didn't answer. Instead, he stepped closer, and with a chilling grin, he raised the whistle to his lips once more. Before I could react, everything went dark. When I woke up, I was back in my seat, surrounded by the sounds of the cheering crowd. The game had ended, and the stadium was beginning to empty. I blinked, disoriented, trying to make sense of what had just happened. Had it been a dream? Had it all been some sort of illusion? But then, I noticed something. The whistleblower's shadowy figure was still standing in the corner of the stadium, watching me from the shadows. I tried to leave, but something kept me there, an invisible force that seemed to hold me captive within the stadium walls. As I made my way toward the exit, I noticed an old sign near the door, one I had never seen before. It was weathered, faded with time, and it read, "Beware the phantom whistleblower." Suddenly, I realized that the figure wasn't just a hallucination or a figment of my imagination. He had been there long before me, and he would remain long after I left, lurking in the darkness of the Bernabéu, waiting for his next victim. And as I stepped out into the cool night air, I could still hear the faint sound of a whistle blowing in the distance, calling me back. 3. The haunted locker room. It was supposed to be an easy night, just a regular game at the Bernabéu. I had tickets to watch Real Madrid play, but as I arrived early, I was offered a rare chance to visit the players' locker room before the match. It was a dream come true, so I didn't hesitate. The locker room was massive, filled with portraits of legends and memorabilia. The smell of fresh turf and a faint scent of cologne hung in the air. I wandered around, admiring the personalized lockers, the trophies, and the signed jerseys. The room seemed alive with the history of the club. That's when I heard it, the faint sound of footsteps. At first, I thought it was just my imagination, but as I turned around, I saw the figure of a man standing near one of the lockers. His back was to me, and he wore a faded jersey, one I recognized from the old days, a relic of a player long retired. I called out to him, but he didn't respond. My heart began to race. The man turned slowly, his face obscured by the shadows. As he came closer, I could see his eyes, hollow, lifeless, and filled with a deep sadness. He raised his hand, and a cold shiver ran through my body. "Why are you here?" he whispered, his voice a raspy, almost inaudible whisper. "This is where I died." Before I could react, the temperature in the room plummeted. I could see my breath in the air as the locker room lights flickered, casting shadows in every corner. The man stepped forward, and I noticed his feet didn't touch the floor. He hovered just above it, his body slowly disintegrating into the air. Panic surged through me as I backed away, my legs shaking uncontrollably. The ghostly figure smiled, a cold, empty smile, and then he vanished, leaving behind a lingering cold that clung to my skin. I stumbled out of the locker room, but the chilling presence of that man followed me for the rest of the night. I could hear his voice whispering through the roar of the crowd, echoing in my mind, "I'm still here." The stadium felt different as the game began, like something or someone was watching me from the shadows. And no matter how hard I tried to push it out of my mind, I couldn't escape the feeling that I wasn't alone. The game had ended, and the stadium was beginning to empty, but something didn't feel right. I had seen the locker room, the place where players had celebrated their victories and stewed over their losses for decades, suddenly turned into a place of overwhelming darkness. As I made my way toward the exit of the stadium, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was calling me back. It wasn't just curiosity, it was an unexplainable urge, a pull from deep within the Bernabéu itself. I found myself standing at the threshold of the locker room. The stadium was mostly empty by now, with only the stadium staff buzzing around cleaning up after the match. But there was something about the room that felt so different. The air was heavier, denser, the kind of weight that sits on your chest, making it hard to breathe. I had heard rumors of strange occurrences here. The whispers of players who swore they'd felt someone or something brush past them in the dark halls. Strange shadows moving in the corners of their eyes. The sound of distant footsteps when no one was supposed to be there. I dismissed it as superstition. But now, standing outside the door, I couldn't help but think of those stories. With a nervous breath, I pushed the door open. The room was lit only by the dim glow of the exit signs. The locker room, usually a buzz of activity, was eerily silent. The lockers were empty, the benches untouched. A few stray towels and bottles littered the floor, but there was no sign of anyone else. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. I walked in, cautiously, every step echoing off the walls. I was about to leave, thinking maybe my mind was playing tricks on me when I heard it, a soft whisper. I spun around, heart racing, but there was no one there. I told myself it was just the wind, the pipes, or maybe an old sound system still running in the background. But then I heard it again. This time, it was clearer. "Get out." My blood ran cold. The voice wasn't coming from behind me. It was coming from somewhere deeper within the locker room. I turned, my eyes scanning every dark corner, looking for any sign of movement. My breath became shallow as I slowly stepped forward. There was something unnatural about the air in here. It felt as though the walls themselves were watching me, closing in around me. Then a door creaked open. It was the coach's office, the room where every strategy was planned, every victory was celebrated, and every defeat analyzed. I hadn't remembered seeing the door open when I first walked in. Now, it was ajar, almost inviting me in. I walked over, hesitant but driven by that strange compulsion I couldn't shake. My hand reached out for the door, and as I pushed it open, the room inside was chillingly cold. The desk, usually filled with papers and trophies, was now bare. A single chair was positioned in the center of the room, facing the wall. The air grew thick as I stepped inside, and there, sitting in the chair, was a figure. A man. No, not a man. His features were distorted, his face pale and expressionless, like a reflection in a cracked mirror. The smell of old sweat, leather, and something more, something foul filled the air. I took a step back, my heartbeat thumping in my ears, but I couldn't look away. The figure didn't move, didn't acknowledge my presence. It just sat there perfectly still, like it had been waiting for me. Suddenly, a loud crash sounded from behind me, followed by the sound of something heavy scraping against the floor. I whipped around, but there was nothing there. The room felt alive now, a dark force pressing in from all sides. And then I heard the whispers again, louder this time, a chorus of voices, all saying the same thing. "Leave, now!" I turned, running out of the office and straight into the locker room. But just as I reached the door, I felt a hand on my shoulder. I spun around, but no one was there. The locker room was empty, as it should have been. Still, that lingering touch was there, as if someone or something had been standing just behind me. The door slammed shut behind me, and the lights flickered out. I fumbled to find the exit, my mind racing, my heart pounding. I could still hear the whispers, growing louder, echoing around me like a sinister chant. Leave, leave, leave. With trembling hands, I reached for the handle of the door and pulled it open. I didn't dare look back. I ran through the hallways of the stadium, my feet barely touching the ground, until I was out in the open air. But even then, as I stood outside, trying to catch my breath, I could still hear the whispers, faint but persistent in my mind. Leave now. That night, I could hardly sleep, haunted by the events in that locker room. I kept seeing the twisted figure in the coach's chair, staring back at me with those empty eyes. The whispers lingered, like a shadow in my thoughts, reminding me that I was never truly alone in that place. And whenever I close my eyes, I can still hear the echoes of that voice, calling me back to the Bernabéu, where the darkness waits. As the echoes of my stories fade into the night, I can't help but wonder, what other secrets does the Bernabéu hold? Will you dare to return, or will these tales haunt your dreams? Remember, the next time you hear the roar of the crowd, listen closely. You might just hear the whispers of those who never left. Until next time, stay brave and keep your lights on.